Dumela. This is Dr. Kumar, and thank you for listening to my recorded lectures. We're still in Lecture 1, Part 2, and today we're going to be talking about characteristics of culture in Part 2. So what are these how is culture characterized? Previously, we talked about definitions of culture. We talked about definitions of communication. We defined all of these concepts and terms. It was a little bit about the history. Now it's time for us to kind of talk about how culture is actually characterized and how scholars have characterized culture. So here are a few ways in which culture is characterized. The first characteristic is that culture is learned. And we learn culture through a variety of ways. What do we mean by that? Well, it's not inborn, right? It's learned. Culture is often learned ways of behavior. Now, when we unlearn behavior, that's not culture. But shaking hands, saying thanks, and the way we dress, all of that is cultural behavior. So how do we learn those things? Well, the first way that we learn it is through acculturation. Acculturation is just basically a way of learning culture. Another way that we learn culture is through assimilation. That means we give up something, part of our culture, in order to kind of fit in with the other culture. So we give up culture in order to fit in, and we gravitate to the new culture. We learn culture through interactions. We connect with other groups of people from other cultures. We learn their ways of being, their ways of behaving, and we pick up on those. We also learn culture through observations. We sit and we review and observe people in action. And so that's one way of learning culture as well. When we observe, we oftentimes imitate. One way that one example that I have of this, if you've ever seen a commercial, I think it's a commercial for Jiffy peanut butter. And there's a little girl who's sitting on the couch with her dad, and he takes his peanut butter sandwich and he folds it, and he looks at her and he does this. He mimics to her. He kind of nods at her and for her to take her peanut butter sandwich and fold it as well. And she says no. But when he turns away, she turns her bread and folds it just like him. So she's imitating his behavior. You'll see kids imitating the behavior of their parents often. And this is the way in which we learn culture. And we also do so through instruction. Sometimes we're instructed to behave a certain way, to act a certain way, to speak a certain way. And that is also how we learn culture. So those are the ways in which we learn culture: through acculturation, assimilation, interaction, observation, imitation, and through instruction. Now, there are other ways that we learn another characteristic of culture as well. And culture is shared. What do we mean that culture is shared? Well, culture is not something that an individual alone can possess, right? Culture is sociological, and so in a sense, it's shared. So, for example, we share customs, we share traditions, we share beliefs, we share ideas and values and morality, or morale. And so these are shared by people of a group in our society. So culture is shared, right? It is something that we do with others. Culture is also, and this, you don't see this here, but I want to share it anyway. Culture is social. It does not exist in isolation. It is a product of our society. So it develops through social interactions with people. No man can acquire culture without association. You don't exist in this little, island alone. It happens in connection with others. So humans become a human only amongst other humans, right? You become cultured amongst other people who share the culture. Culture is also passed from generation to generation, right? That means it's transmissive. It is transmitted from one generation to another. Language is the main vehicle by which this takes place. So language in different forms makes it possible for the present generation to understand the achievement of earlier generations. So the transmission of culture may take place by imitation as well as by instruction, as I mentioned earlier. Culture is symbolic. But what does that mean? Well, meanings are attached to a particular part of a cultural practice or an environment. So we symbolize them. So let's say the cross is a symbol for Christians. Rings worn on the left index finger is a sign for people who are in love or who are married. The flag may be a symbol for loyalty for one's country. So those are examples. Think of examples of your own as well as you write your notes. Culture is also selective. So let's move forward. It is selective. We don't know everything about our culture. So there is some knowledge that is specialized. So for example, there is knowledge only known to men, but not to women. And there are some knowledge only known to certain ethnic groups, but not another ethnic group. Occupations, by religion, by social classes. So understand that there's certain knowledge that is known by particular groups, but not other groups. And that's what we mean by culture is selective. Culture is integrative. Various parts of the culture clearly related and integrated into a whole, but not an individual matter, but it's a collective product, like civil rights movement, like the women's rights movement, like gay rights movement. You know, it was for a particular people, but it was integrated into the full society. Now, culture is also subject to change. It's another characteristic. And it changes, which means that it's not static, it's not rigid. And it changes through innovation, which means that, you know, technology helps our culture change. So as we innovate and create new ways of doing things, we create new tools, new ways of getting around, new ways of transporting ourselves, new ways of communicating. That is innovating, and that creates a new cultural mode. Culture also changes through diffusion. It's disseminated, it's distributed, and that might include migration. Right. It changes through calamity. That means that there may be some disaster like 9/11, change the ways in which we go through airports. Wars might change the way in which we connect. So culture is subject to change. And finally, culture is ethnocentric, which means that we make value judgments about another culture from the perspective of our own culture. Is that a bad thing? Well, it can be, because we use our own cultural system, and we sometimes believe that there's only one way of seeing things, which is our way of seeing things, and that relegates the other group as being lesser than. Right. So when we go someplace else, when we go to another country, and we believe that they should be speaking English, you know, why don't they speak English? And why are they speaking this language? That's ethnocentrism. Right? That's ethnocentric. Instead of going into the language and going through the culture and expecting them to speak their language, right? Or to have food that is, or to partake in the food that they cook in their own culture, right? Why don't they have a burger, right? That's ethnocentric. So what I want to do is kind of cover a metaphor that's often used in culture. Culture is like an iceberg. That's the metaphor. And the part of an iceberg is above the water, and part of the iceberg is below the water. The surface culture, the part that we can see, that's the visible part. That's the tangible part. That's the part that's above. But the deep culture, that's the part we can't see. That's the part that's hidden. That's the part that's not tangible. And so when we talk about cultures like an iceberg, you know, icebergs are really colossal. They're very big, but they're bigger even at the bottom. So it's it's a really great metaphor to use when we talk about culture, because we think that we see this very large piece, and we think that when we see people, that's all of what the culture is. But there's so much more to a person's culture. There's a large part of the culture that we can't see, the part that's hidden to us, the part that's intangible to us. So this is what that iceberg model would actually look like. And these are the things that we see. These are the conscious things that are aware. And so what you see in front of you is an iceberg, and you see that there's a marker, there's a line. That's right here. And so the things that we see are things like the dress, the ways in which people dress. We may be able to see one's age, or at least the age that we believe that they are. We may be able to see what a person's race or ethnicity is, although we may be making assumptions about that. We may be able to see a person's gender, at least what we assume to be a person's gender based on the biology of that. And we'll talk about that later on as well. And we may be able to tell what a person's language is once they start to speak, but we cannot see it. So those are the things that we become conscious and aware of. But those things that are out of awareness is a person's eye behavior, their collaborative styles, their self-authority, patterns of handling emotions, group decision-making patterns, concepts of status and mobility, body language, problem solving, what their roles and relationships are, their status by age and sex and class, and a whole lot more. So there's a lot that we don't understand that's out of our awareness. So I want you to think about these questions as it relates to that model that we just saw. What did you notice about the chart? Number one, there's a whole lot less that we are aware of at the top than there was at the bottom. So when you look at those sets of characteristics, what sets are the most substantive? Well, the ones at the bottom were. In other words, which ones really make us or define who we are as human beings, and those above or those below the line. And it looks like those below the line is the real answer. So over which of the characteristics do we have the most choice? Those above or below the line? Think about that. When we quickly judge another person, what set of characteristics is our judgment based on? Above or below the line? What lessons can we learn then from this particular exercise? Think about that. Write it down in your notes. So when we're using our little iceberg exercise, what might we learn about culture, right? Cultures are very diverse. That's one thing that we should learn. So the field of communication, right? I just want to throw this in because a lot of people don't understand what we do in the field of communication. And I want to just kind of take us on this journey for a moment to help us understand what we focus on. The field of communication focuses on how people use messages and generate meanings within and across various contexts, across various cultures, within and across various cultures, and within and across various channels and media forms. This comes from the work of Lang in 2009, who's one of our scholars. And so when we understand communication, when people ask, what do you do in communication studies? That's what we do. It's not about just presenting and public speaking. We are so much deeper than that. Our field focuses on how people use messages and generate meanings in a variety and within and across a variety of contexts, cultures, channels, and media. Okay, so that's what we do. So that's part 2. We'll come back a little bit later. Thank you for listening to this lecture recording.